Hello, we're picking up where we left off. So as you saw at the end of the previous recording, at this point we have to go back. We have to kind of start at the beginning and look over some of the basics. So after you've read the chapter, this will make a great deal more sense to you. So this is your first exposure, that will be your second exposure. So visually, what you want to understand is that a single sugar molecule in food ultimately becomes a single glucose molecule in the body, and that the linked chains of sugar molecules in food called starch ultimately become individual glucose molecules within the body, and that the linked chains of sugar molecules in food called fiber are those which we lack the enzyme to digest, so ultimately they do not break down, therefore we do not absorb those sugar molecules and they do not become blood glucose. So you're going to learn more about fiber as you read, but a key point is that the three structural forms of carbohydrate in food, sugars, starches, and fibers, are the knowledge that we can actually apply in the real world. If you recall, I said we're not going to speak in reality in terms of mono, di, and polysaccharides. That's really meaningless information to the average person, especially patients with less education than ourselves. So we're going to talk in terms of sugars, starches, and fibers, which are, as you know, what's listed on the Nutrition Facts panel. So polysaccharides, remember, all those multiple saccharides linked together, starches and fibers. But as you will quickly come to understand, fibers are the ones which we cannot digest, both soluble and insoluble fibers. So these slides are provided for you within the weekly module so that you can actually open them up and use them visually. Perhaps you even want to print off a given slide. Printing off the whole slideshow would be quite a bit of ink and paper. So what I would recommend is that if you choose to print any of it, you simply print the pages that you feel are most helpful. In the interest of time, I'm not going to linger on all of these slides for a long time since you have access to them, but this particular visual, as well as some others I'm providing, should be extremely useful to you to help you understand what I'm speaking of and what you're reading about this week. So looking at this, these simple sugar molecules that are the result of digestion of carbohydrates are simply going to be absorbed from the small intestine into the circulating bloodstream. So they are literally passing through the walls, the semi-permeable membranes of the small intestine, and entering all of the blood vessels that are both in the walls and outside of the walls so that they can circulate to all of our trillions of cells to be utilized as fuel. So if we were to take a honed-in view and we're looking inside a blood vessel, what we see here are the particles of sugar from our carbohydrate. At this point, now that they're in the bloodstream, we no longer refer to them as sugar. So although many people will say blood sugar, as clinicians we use the phrase blood glucose. So you see that as we begin to digest our food and absorb all of the carbohydrate into our bloodstream, there is a rise in blood glucose. The volume obviously increases in our blood. And at that point, that is going to tell the body that fuel is on board, the fuel tank has been filled up, just like if you pulled up to a gas pump and filled up your gas tank. And so the body will in turn respond in kind and attempt to move the fuel out of the fuel line and into all of the respective engines, which are your body's trillions of cells. And so all of your cells have, in essence, little doors on them and keys that accompany the doors. So if you keep that in mind moving forward, when we study errors in metabolism at a later date and we look at specific illnesses such as diabetes, you'll be able to intellectualize what's happening with this sort of visual. So you can see that the glucose is leaving the blood and it's entering into the cell via the doorway, and that's because there was an available key and the key worked in the lock and the door was able to open. So what is the key that I'm speaking of? That would be insulin. If you don't already know this, insulin is a hormone secreted by the pancreas. So when the blood glucose is absorbed through the walls of the small intestine into the bloodstream, then the pancreas is stimulated to secrete the hormone insulin. The insulin is also released into the bloodstream, and the insulin then reaches out to the cells and attempts to act as a key in the respective keyholes for the doors, therefore allowing the doors to open so that the glucose can enter and engage in the biochemical reactions that facilitate all of our biochemistry we've previously looked at. So just a few pictures to help you get your mind around this concept. Again, you can print the slides or you can just open them up and look through them. So at this point, between the first part of the video and then picking up at this point, you may be feeling a bit overwhelmed, but as is indicated on your written assignment, this is still the beginning. It's a lot to take in if you don't have any background in this. It's going to start to seem more natural and easier as we move forward. We just have to get the tough stuff out of the way first. So again, I have several slides here that I'm not going to spend time reading to you, but that are excellent visuals, and one may appeal to you more than the other. So take time to hit pause or to go back and look at these slowly and decide for yourself which ones most effectively help you to interpret and understand things. You will see terms on each of these slides that are referenced in your book, and hopefully when you read and look back at these, it will begin to make more sense. Here you see glucagon and insulin, which are two important terms that we're going to be using throughout the course. Here's another visual to help you appreciate the differing roles of insulin and glucagon. They act in opposition to one another. They do two totally opposite things. Both are secreted by the pancreas, but for opposite purposes, which is explained in your book. Another visual to help you understand glucose homeostasis. We'll talk more about this at a later date. And the opposite is illustrated here. So you see the function of insulin first and glucagon second. So now that you understand how the body uses or metabolizes the macronutrient carbohydrate at the cellular level, it helps you to appreciate that the body doesn't differentiate between its original source of carbohydrate. It wouldn't matter if it were candy or cake or pie or soda or juice, or for that matter wine. It wouldn't matter if it was fruit or vegetable or grain or bean. By the time everything reaches the cellular level and it's in its most finite molecular structure, sugar, or at that point glucose, it's either going to be utilized productively or it's going to be turned into triglycerides or fat molecules, which are the components of our fat cells, our adipose cells. That's the body's form of fuel storage as a reserve for a time of crisis. So then why does it matter where it came from in the first place? Why does what we eat matter? Well, it goes back to the basics that we've already addressed, right? We ultimately want to choose nutrient-dense foods because, oh, by the way, not only do we get fuel from our food, but we also get a wealth of other valuable nutrients that we've yet to address, but that you're now familiar with. And we know that variety, moderation, and balance are what help ensure that we are getting everything we need, not too little and not too much. So we've come full circle. If you listen to the entirety of the first and the second portion thus far, then now you have a greater appreciation and you know what is not correct. You know there is no food group called carbohydrates, that carbohydrate is the name of a macronutrient contained within foods, and all foods except meat and eggs contain carbohydrate. You know that the assumption that sugar is bad for us is just information taken out of context, because there are naturally occurring sugars, there are added sugars, and foods that contain naturally occurring sugars are those foods which are nutrient dense, whereas added sugars are purely fuel, and very few people need additional fuel. At a later point, when we look at inflammation, you'll also see that there are additional harms associated with excess added sugar. So remember, there is a TUL for added sugar. We learned about how to assess that on the new nutrition facts panels that are coming out. And aside from calories being a concern in excess, we also know that too much added sugar has other health implications, such as contributing to internal inflammation, and that internal inflammation underlies or is a driver behind many other disease processes. So it's one of the many factors that contributes to the etiology of assorted health problems. We know that sugar does not cause diabetes. We haven't dug into the details of what does, but you know now that it is multifactorial, and that one's intake of carbohydrate is really only relevant once the disease of diabetes has been diagnosed, that sugar is not directly correlated with the onset of diabetes. And you know that it's a myth that people with diabetes should avoid sugar, because obviously carbohydrate is the body's preferred and primary fuel source, and everyone needs carbohydrate, and ultimately every bit of carbohydrate we take in that is able to reach our cells is sugar or glucose at that point. So it is more about how much an individual with diabetes takes in, and did it come from a nutrient-dense source? In other words, it's no different than why you and I care about the source. So let's take a quick look at your textbook, as we've done before, flipping through very briefly to draw your attention to things. The learning objectives, as always, on page 39 are really important, as is the Did You Know section on page 40. And then you see all of these terms here. Many of them have been addressed on the assignment. There are probably a handful of them that aren't as relevant, but by and large you're going to be utilizing most of those terms. So as you go through the first few pages, you see an introduction to the acronym for carbohydrates, or rather the medical abbreviation CHO. You see references and explanations of what I've already addressed in terms of mono, di, and polysaccharides. You see the word glycogen down here at the bottom, so this is key information that you want to read very carefully in terms of glycogen. And over here on 42, where you see the word gluconeogenesis, you see fiber, you see insoluble and soluble, which I've referenced, so you want to read about those very carefully. Right here where it begins the function of carbohydrates, the first paragraph really gets you off on the right foot. And when you get over here to 43, it gets into digestion and metabolism. Now, while there's a lot of important information here, including the word glycogenolysis, and you see glucagon, up here where you see all this information about transport systems, you can just kind of skim that. I'm not going to be expecting you to explain the GLUT2 transport system. And then it references the glycemic index, and you do have some information on your assignment that addresses that, so you'll need to give that a look. And then you get into some of what we've already covered, and you should easily understand in terms of simple and complex carbohydrates, as well as the nutrition facts panel. Clicking through a couple of pages further, you're going to see the image of a whole grain. You definitely want to understand these components. They've been referenced in previous chapters. Now you start to bring your understanding to a greater fruition, and the explanation in terms of the role of refining grains and enriching grains is included right here. Two key terms, refined and enriched, that have already been used and will be used on future occasions as well. You get over here to page 48. There is this wonderful little practice pearl, so I draw your attention to that. It will have practical application value for you. And then you get into the carbohydrate recommendations, which you can skim. The discussion board associated with this chapter is based on this information, so you'll see some repetition in the discussion board as well. As always, it might be worthwhile to glance at the cultural considerations. And then again, fiber is emphasized on this page, so I think you'll find some very useful information here to help you glean your full understanding of fiber. There's a wonderful patient education checklist. You could at least just skim through that as well. And as you know, interactions with medications is something that we're going to delve into more at later dates. So it's nice to look at these things and get some concept of why we care. For example, it tells you here, regardless of the fiber supplement source, absorption of some medications can be diminished when the medication and the supplement are taken within a short time frame. So we're going to have a lot of patients who are taking all kinds of Metamucil and other forms of fiber supplements, and they're not going to understand that timing is imperative. And when people are in a polypharmacy circumstance, as you're now familiar with, there are so many things like that that have to be considered, and it's really hard for people to juggle all of that. So sometimes you have to pick the lesser of the evils and decide how to, address things accordingly. Here you begin to look at the non-nutritive, and that would be your artificial sweeteners versus nutritive sweeteners. So skim through that, looking for the key points. The hot topic kind of is a continuation of that for what value it has. And then it starts to tap into the wellness concerns. I wouldn't dig too deeply here. Again, I would skim through these components to prep yourself. The most relevant section being altered digestion or metabolism. That's going to come up in the future. And you want to have a good solid understanding of lactose intolerance, as well as the fact that there are definitely errors in metabolism, different disorders that you may encounter in a nursing setting, especially in a pediatric setting. And as always, if you feel that it's beneficial, you certainly want to look over the evidence-based practice section. And that brings us to the end of the chapter on the low-carb diets for epilepsy. There's certainly a lot of media focus on this, and so you can see the clinical applications, although there is some conflicting research, and there is always new research, or rather are new research endeavors in place to find out how we can tweak this to make it a wonderful form of medical nutrition therapy for those with epilepsy. Unfortunately, there's still a lot that we don't know, but that would be something that if you have the time to read, I would highly recommend that you do. Otherwise, you can go back to it at a later date for your own benefit. And so that wraps up the chapter with the nursing care section. And as always, your outline of your nursing care plan process is here, and your chapter summary that gives you an opportunity to just quickly assess your takeaway knowledge. So this takes me once again back to our slides, and at this point, of course, if you have any questions, hopefully you've jotted them down, you're posting them in the general discussion area. But there is one last thing that I want to emphasize that really didn't fit in well anywhere else. Certainly we've made references to beans. Legumes is the more formal term that's usually used. Sometimes you will see all different kinds of beans listed along with the word legumes, but if you really want to keep things simple, legumes just means beans, so those words can be used interchangeably. And throughout the text, when it's referencing legumes or beans, it's referencing all types: pinto, black, navy, cannellini, the list goes on. The idea is that beans have great value to our health in numerous ways. One of them is that they are high in fiber. As you now understand, they are a plant food. They are very high in fiber. As you will see in a later chapter, they are also an excellent source of protein, so they're a great alternative to animal foods in that respect. Additionally, unlike animal foods which contain certain fats we need to limit in our diet, such as saturated fat and cholesterol, beans have none of either. So beans are a great way to get a lot of protein and a lot of fiber to make us feel full and to promote internal health of our GI tract, as well as the fact that they help remove cholesterol out of our bloodstream, and they're very inexpensive, and we can purchase them already cooked in cans as long as we know to select low sodium canned beans, 5% or less, as you know, so that we can use them for a multitude of purposes. So you have these little cartoon images here, and I will leave you with the Bean song. If you have a good sense of humor, you may appreciate this song. If not, you may find it offensive, so you can make that call for yourself.
Beans, the musical fruit. The more you eat, the more you toot. The more you toot, the better you feel. So let's have beans for every meal. Ate my beans and they were loaded. Went to bed and they exploded. Beans are good for your heart. The more you eat, the more you fart. The more you fart, the better you feel. So let's have beans for every meal. Beans, good for your heart. The more you eat, the more you fart. The more you fart, the more you eat. The more you sit on the toilet seat. Beans, the musical fruit. The more you eat, the more you toot. The more you toot, the better you feel. So lift up your leg and let one squeal.